Hi everybody, welcome back to Compare Art Supplies with Bats, Cats and Broomsticks. Today we will be comparing the Reeves Art Supply watercolour tin that I used to use when I was in high school, which was quite some time ago. They no longer make this palette, but in its day this was a really good, really cheap watercolour palette that was exceptional for somebody who was in high school who wanted to learn colour theory, very basics of mixing paints. It was a fabulous, cheap, around £4 watercolour palette, which you could definitely use to learn how to mix and make your own shading and starting to learn. The closest one that I found today to this palette is this palette by Crawford and Black. It's a £3 palette which I bought from the works. Let's open it up and have a look inside. So right from the get-go we can see the difference in these two palettes. I had to buy this one special because I lost mine, but I'm really glad to have it again because it's nice to remember nostalgically. First thing we can tell the difference with is that we get an ochre in the Reeves palette versus the Crawford and Black palette. And the other thing I feel is different is the vibrancy that we get in the Reeves palette. It's just so much more bold. You can definitely tell that it's more bold and colourful from just looking at it. So I'm going to swatch these two out so that you guys can have a look, see the differences between them as we go. I just wanted to take this moment to say that this is not sponsored. I am doing this just because I'm passionate about art and I wanted to share my views and opinions on these palettes. So I'm going to start with the Reeves palettes, and I'm going to start at the top here with Black. It's a really nice, strong, bold colour. I'm really happy with it. Moving on, we've got the Van Dyke Brown, which is a really nice brown in this palette. It's just a nice brown. Then we've got our Burnt Sienna, which the other palette doesn't have, and I feel like it's really missing out not having the Burnt Sienna, because it's a hard colour to mix and you need it all the time. It's not impossible to mix it, it's just that it's really hard and time consuming when it's something you need so often. We've got this nice red, just a nice deep red. We've got our Vermilion Orange, which is just a nice mid-tone, even orange. Got Persian Blue. Persian Blue in this particular set is really quite nice. It's really strong, vibrant, definitely a proper Persian Blue. Then we've got Ultramarine, which I think is a nice counterpart, a much softer, warmer blue. Then we've got Hooker's Green, which is a foresty, deep, dark green colour. It takes a little bit more to work up the pigment for the greens in this palette, but they're still really very pigmented. Especially considering this palette is really very old now. We've got Leaf Green colour here, which is a nice, even, bright leaf green colour. Yellow Ochre in this palette again, which isn't in the Crawford and Black palette, is something that I feel like would be a miss for me if a beginner's palette didn't have it. Because it is another colour that's hard to mix, that you use a lot of. And then we got our lemon yellow or bright yellow colour here,
which is a really, really very nice bright yellow that washes down really well. And we've got our white at the end. I'm going to swatch the white to see if there's any tinting or staining from the white, like maybe from whatever they've used to turn it into a pigment block. So one other thing about the Reeves palette is that they don't feel very chalky, which is nice. So here we've got the Crawford Black, which comes with its own little watercolour brush, which I thought was a nice touch. And it's a real watercolour brush. A lot of palettes make the mistake of adding a brush that's just plastic bristles, and they're just terrible. Really, really terrible. The set would have been better out not having a brush in it at all than adding one of those brushes. But this one has a really nice soft brush. It's really nice, user-friendly brush. As I'm washing these colours down, this is the brown now, I feel like they're not as strong of a pigment. They feel almost like they're a bit chalkier. They definitely look a lot more chalky. You can see the difference looking at the palettes themselves. This is a vermilion, so I'm going to swatch it next to the vermilion in the swatches I've done before, just to have a side-by-side comparison. And it's a little bit weaker, but it is definitely a vermilion. We've got this crimson red. As I'm swatching it here now, I can see that it's not a very strong red. It's a lot more warm orange tone than the Reeves palette. The Reeves palette has a much more defined red. This one's a lot more dark orange. And then we've got our yellow orange, which I thought that this palette didn't really need to have. I would have preferred it if it had maybe the burnt sienna or the ochre yellow than having an additional orange that could be easily mixed with the yellow and the vermilion. I thought that it was a little bit unnecessary. I'm going to swatch it at the bottom because there's no other colour like it in the other palette. It's a nice orange. There's Persian blue. I thought the Persian blue was a really nice colour, but that it lacked pigment strength. We have ultramarine, which personally I feel wasn't different enough from the Persian blue. The hooker's green. Now the green in this palette just feels a little bit too blue, too minty. This one looks more teal than it does a forest green. Then we've got our leaf green, which washed out too easily, didn't have any boldness to it, felt a bit more like a mint colour. We've got a yellow colour, which I thought was really, really nice. Quite bright yellow. And last of all, I'm going to swatch out the white, just to show you the difference. It does have a little bit of pigment staining, a little bit grey maybe, but not overly so, not noticeably. So nobody's asked me to review these palettes, they're not sponsored. This is just me giving my opinion because I'm really passionate about watercolours, I'm passionate about painting altogether really, and I wanted to do a comparison with what I started out painting with versus what you can typically get for the same price range now. The Reeves palette I used to use is no longer in circulation. It took me a lot of work to find one of these palettes because you can't buy them anymore. They still make watercolours, you just can't buy this specific palette that I used to own because it's out of circulation. I lost mine years ago, honestly. But you can see how bold and bright they are. And I'm hoping that I can buy one of their newer versions to show you the difference between that and this one. So looking back at these swatches, I am noticing definite differences in pigmentation, definite differences in overall quality of how they sit on the paper once they've been swatched out. The Crawford Black ones are just a little bit more washed out and lacking in pigment, I think. So the Crawford Black palette, I think it has its uses and it has its values, definitely. I think that it would be best suited for maybe young children, supervised obviously, to paint colouring books or do crafts, or if you're doing something where the final finish of the product isn't a major concern. Whilst the Reeves palette gives you really decent, bold, bright, nice colour, I'd say you could do quite a lot with this Reeves palette, and that it is a really, really good starting point for a student. I wanted to just test out that pigment washout wasn't just because I used the brush provided in the palette, but even with my brush that picked up a little bit more pigment, you can still see the same way of sitting on the paper. You can still see that it sits washed out and clumps into the little corners. Here I thought I would also do a little test of how these colours mixed together so that you can see how they blend out. I thought I'd do a yellow to orange and just blend them out to see how they work together, how they interact. I thought that the Reeves palette interacted really well on the paper together, whilst maintaining that nice bold colour. I may have put a little bit too much water on the page here, so we might get a little bit of bleeding in the colour. And I'm going to swatch out and mix on this tin an even mid-tone orange. For one, because I wanted to show just how easy it is to get a mid-tone orange, and secondly so that we can see how well it sits on the page mixed, how well they mix to create a new colour without turning a muddy, disgusting colour. So the Reeves palette here sits nice and even as though it's a new colour altogether, which I'm really happy with, and really maintains its brightness as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing in the Crawford Black tin. Here we've got a yellow. I'm just going to wash it out real quick. I thought that the yellow here just didn't keep that boldness the same way. It washed out really very weak immediately. Same with the orange. And the next thing I noticed is that they wanted to sit separate to one another. There was very clear defined blocky lines in between the yellow and the orange, and it looks really muddy in the middle. We have our yellow block, our orange block, and I'm just gonna try and swatch some colours into the tin here and mix up an orange, a mid-tone orange. Although there is a mid-tone orange in this tin, I wanted to do it to see how it behaved the same. It was really hard to get any pigment or water to sit in this tin, unlike the Reeves palette, because it seemed incredibly hydrophobic. Whilst the Reeves tin lid did want to behave a lot like a palette would and let you mix on the lid. So I had a little bit of a hard time getting it to remain there. And then I found a really decent mid-tone orange that I thought was okay. And when I swatched it down on the page, I felt again that it wanted to sit separately and the mix of colours looks just a little bit muddy. I'm going to let those two mixes that I've put in the tin dry out. You can see the clear differences really in all these colours, in how they want to sit and stay on the page. So let them dry in the tin and I'll come back and we can have a look, see how they're reactivating. Now that they've dried, I'm going to add some water into the tins and see how they reactivate and whether or not they lose any pigment strength in doing that, or if they become muddy or discoloured. Start with the Reeves tin here. I thought that the Reeves tin one didn't even lose any pigment strength whatsoever. It swatched like I hadn't left it there to dry at all. And then we did the same thing with the Crawford Black palette, but this time it looked as though it was even more washed out than before, so we had a loss of pigment strength from leaving it to dry and letting it sit in the tin. I just felt like I could definitely see the same strength of pigment in the Reeves swatch, and it took to being built up on, so I could add more of that pigment to the pigment underneath and it didn't discolour or get muddy and bleed everywhere, so I didn't have colour running, which I was really impressed with. This is all stuff that I would expect from a really high-end palette to be able to do. Now, as far as high-end is concerned, I wouldn't say that it is the same, but it has a lot of the qualities of a high-end palette while still maintaining a really budget-friendly price. If I was starting out watercolours again from the very beginning, I would be thrilled with the Reeves palette, because you can do what you need to do to learn from this palette. For the price of £4 when I used to have it, that's really reasonable. Now, Reeves do still make palettes, they do still make watercolours. I am going to get some and do future videos on the newer things that they sell and see how they stock up to what I had when I was younger. And I'll compare some more palettes of similar price ranges and in the cheaper ranges as well, to show you guys what's available out there. All of these videos currently are being filmed with the UK in mind, because these are palettes I can buy here in Britain. I do not know if they're available elsewhere in the world at the moment. I'm just focusing on what's available here to me as I was growing up, as I could just walk into the shop and find, because that's the idea that I wanna cover to start with. If anybody wants to see any specific watercolour getting covered, or any paint, and you want to see how they work, please leave me a comment and a message, and I will try my best to get it and show you how it works, swatch it out for you on camera. And I would just love to hear from you, hear your opinion. Tell me if Reeves was your first palette when you were growing up. In the Reeves palette, this red is one of my favourite reds. It's really actually hard to come by this red in the same pigment strength and depth. It is such a lovely, beautiful, rich red colour. I just wanted to doodle this little apple here to demonstrate a tiny little bit of the differences that I found in these palettes whilst doing the swatches in a tiny painting. Which is that I can add pigment colour to the Reeves palette really easily, and it doesn't want to just bleed or turn muddy instantaneously. I can really work that colour and the pigment. I'm just going to take some of it off and build it back up again to allow for a little speck of light at the top there to give the sense of this being spherical. Then I'll do the same thing with the Crawford and Black palette and see how they... And I'm gonna put a little bit of a green leaf here with the hooker's green. Just make a tiny little apple doodle. And from this doodle, I hope you can see how strong the colour is and how nice it transitions in shade. And just to compare, we've got the Crawford and Black, which, like, straight from the get-go I feel is a lot less red. The pigment wants to sit less evenly on the page, and it's harder to build up that gradient shadow. Because the colour just sits in these little blotches, I think. And I just wanted to compare these two blues in a wash, just to show how they gradient down in colour. And I feel like this blue shows you just how much softer the gradient in the Reeves palette is. And especially considering how old this palette is, it's just really nice to see that it's standing up to the test of time, really. And just clean the palette up here. Now that I've done a swatch of these palettes, both the palettes, I'm going to show you guys how they'd work in a painting to give you a better idea of how they layer, how they interact with each other if you were really painting with them. And the painting I chose to do this week was a sunflower, and I'm going to do these sunflowers just straight up from a reference, not having sketched any outlines or anything like that. It's going to be a sort of free-form watercolour session where I just have a really quick go. This is the kind of art I would do if I'm journaling for myself, because I just want it to be rough. I want it to have that rustic, rough, almost unfinished appeal that you find a lot of people who work with, like, then putting ink and pen over the top. I just really love that loose way of working when you're, like, keeping memories or journals or stuff like that. So I'm going to do it that way and have a go at showing you how these colours would build up on each other, how they keep separation in layers, how they dry, and how much depth of pigment or pigment difference you can get in them as well. So I'm going to show you that next. So here we go. We've got another little piece of watercolour paper here, and I'm gonna just get on with it. I'm gonna dub over this next step with some music and just speed up the video a little bit so that you can just see it more when it's finished. So now that I've started putting the layers down here, you can really start seeing how they're interacting. I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit here because these layers took quite a long time to dry. And coming back to it, I've already put down the yellow ochre and some Van Dyke brown and put in the middle of the top foot sunflowers some of that burnt sienna colour to just add that little bit of depth of colour. And underneath it, all I've used is the brown available in the palette, washed out and dotted in a stronger pigment as I could make it, and the yellow colour mixed with the brown that was available in the palette. And there you have it. The difference between the two palettes is really quite obvious when you look at it now finished as a painting. You can see that you really can get away with learning how to use watercolours with the Reeves palette, but that the Crawford Black palette really does sort of end up leaving your painting at the end looking a bit like a camera picture that's taken that's completely out of focus. All the colours, they don't want to build on each other, they just start going muddier and muddier, and the yellow didn't want to sit separate in shade, so a washed out yellow versus then building up a deeper contrasting colour next to it. Whilst the Reeves palette was perfectly happy to let me leave those washed out bits as highlights, build up other parts, have really, really strong parts with the yellow ochre and much more subdued parts in other places. So I really do feel like you could learn a lot more from the Reeves palette than from the Crawford and Black palette. But if you have, you know, somebody you want to get presents for as an artist, somebody you want to get some art supplies for, you wouldn't be able to go wrong with the Reeves palette here. But the Crawford and Black is more for much younger children, not somebody who's starting to learn colour theory. Maybe someone who's still painting in colouring books or doing crafts with their parents or teachers. Something more like that is what I would say. But again, this is just my opinion, and I just wanted to show you guys what it looked like on the paper, swatched out, so you can make your own decision based on that. Until next time, please like, comment and subscribe. I do read the comments. If you want to leave asking me anything about the palette or where you can find them or anything like them, or if you want to see a certain palette be shown, just leave a comment down below.